Developing the budget. The budget is the fiscal side of your application reflecting the costs necessary to carry out the activities. It must be reasonable and tied to project objectives and the work plan. The budget has two required parts, the line item and the budget justification narrative. To begin your budget, these are the considerations you'll have to incorporate. First one, we've mentioned it a couple of times in other recordings, is align the approach and the objective work plan with your budget. So you want to make sure that nothing appears in your budget that hasn't been addressed earlier in the approach and the objective work plan. Next, you want to take into account your available resources. So you want to go back to the partnerships and resources activities we did earlier, where you have your list of items that you need to acquire through your project. You want to have that list available so that you make sure that you don't miss anything. The next is you want to make sure that there are several people within your project or your organization that are very familiar with the federal regulations, and that is specifically 45 CFR Part 200. The next is start gathering your cost estimates. You're going to need these. They need to be fairly detailed, and we'll definitely get into that in the next slides. Okay, to begin gathering cost estimates, we'll start with staff. So staff includes salaries and fringe benefits. You should work closely with your HR finance people to determine, the salaries that are be vetted through your organization. That also includes the amount of fringe. So in addition to determining the salary and the fringe, you also need to identify the percentage of full-time equivalent or FTE that you'll be using for that each staff person, and identify that in both your line item and your budget justification. So full-time equivalent can be anything from 100% to 50%, 20%, 10%, whatever is applicable and works with the amount of commitment for that salaried person that they're committing to the project. Now is a good time to know the positions that you already have filled, and then also know the ones that will need to be posted and filled once the project is funded, so you can plan accordingly. Consultants, if they're needed, now is the time to doing the research on them. It'll give you the opportunity to get with your organization to know whether it needs to go out to an RFP or a request for proposals, or whether you can sole source. Just remember that the default is your organization's policies. If it is okay for you to use a consultant and sole source for them, which means that you have the consultant already identified because you've worked with them in the past, you're familiar with their qualifications, you're very comfortable for the amount that they require, and that's allowable within your organization, by all means use them. And then you can include all that background information about what the scope of work is they're going to be responsible for, and then include their qualifications and their credentials to be that consultant that is able to do that work. If you need to send it out per your organization for requests for proposals, now's the time to do that. You will still need to develop those scopes of work and gather estimates on how much to budget for that consultant positions that you're looking for. Consultants, now's a good time to let you know that consultants aren't considered staff, so they will be under the other category, and we'll get into that when we get to it. So the next one is travel, and travel is for salaried staff only. So you're not going to include consultant travel under travel. It is for salaried staff, usually overnight and out of state. So there are two required travel requirements that you need to include in your application, which is attendance to the post award and the grantee meeting. And they're both for two people to attend. The post award is for year one only, and then the grantee meeting is every year of the project. So even with the travel restrictions due to COVID, or travel restrictions you might have with your own organization, as far as we know, A&E still wants you to include that cost, and unless they state otherwise, and we haven't heard that yet. So research those costs according to your own travel policies, and that usually includes airfare, lodging, per diem, ground transportation, parking, everything that is in accordance with your travel policies, and include that under travel. And in addition to the required travel, if you have travel for salaried staff to do attend other types of conferences or whatever, you're going to need to research and break down those costs the same way. Equipment is defined as tangible personal property having a useful life of more than 1 year and a cost of more than $5,000 per single unit. So these are very large items. And an example of an equipment purchase would be if you're doing a food sovereignty project and you need a tractor. So what's important to know about equipment, any item that you have listed under equipment, you do need to include a quote either from the vendor or through an internet search, and that needs to be included in your application so that now's the time during the planning phase to gather all this. And even if you do have a specific or unique type of item that you need for your project, even if it doesn't qualify as under equipment, it doesn't, meaning it doesn't meet that $5,000 threshold, it would be a good idea to include a quote as well. Just if it's unique and something that a normal, an everyday person wouldn't be familiar with the cost, you can include that as well. The next one is supplies, and supplies are consumable office or consumable meeting supplies. That goes under this category, and you can research. Now's the time to do the research to find out how much you generally spend on those to include it in your budget. Then the last one is other. So as you can guess, it's everything else that's included. So we talked about consultants not fitting under travel, or under staff. So this is where you're going to include consultants in their travel. You're also going to include any local travel for your staff, because remember, the travel category is for overnight and out of state. So it'll be everything else as well: utilities, computer, software, rent, meeting space, stipends, printing, professional services. When in doubt, put it under other. So now's the time to research all these costs during this planning phase. So one thing we haven't mentioned, or we have mentioned, but we haven't talked in detail, is the non-federal share requirement. And it is a requirement, and it is the grantee's share to support the project. So non-federal share can include just straight up cash if you're lucky enough to be in a tribe or organization that can do that. Or it can be, most of the time, it's going to be services or salaries or a resource. So as long as those services, salaries, or resources aren't funded by other federal agencies, you can use it and apply it towards your non-federal share. Of course, there are some exceptions. There are some federal agencies that do allow their salary personnel to be used as non-federal share, but you need to double check, and I can't emphasize this enough, double check with that agency's, your program specialist from that agency, to make sure that you can do that. So, so you need 20%, and that is 20% of the total project cost. And you need that 20% for each year of your project. It is not something that you can average across your 3-year projects. Like, you can't have 10% in 1 year, 30 in year 2, and then 20% in the last year. It has to be a minimum of 20% for each year of your project. And also, there's no benefit to exceeding the 20%. We ask you to get to 20%, close to 20% as possible without going under, because there is no benefit to exceeding that. It doesn't make you look any better. You don't get any brownie points. You just needlessly overcommitting to a requirement. So stay close to 20% as possible. And also, you do need to provide the documentation for the source of your non-federal share. So this is the time to do this during this planning phase. Anything that is dedicated to non-federal share, now's the time to gather the letter of commitment from the source, the source that's providing it. If it's coming from your own tribe or organization, you got to make sure to include that in a tribal resolution or a board resolution, you need to have that clause in there that's committing that support. Okay, so let's go over how to calculate the non-federal share. So as we mentioned, it's 20% of total project costs. So for an example, if your total project cost is $125,000 for a year, your match that you're responsible is 20% of that. So you can multiply 125,000 by 20.2, which is the equivalent to 20%, which comes to $25,000. So for a project total of 125,000, your commitment as the organization is 25,000 for the non-federal share. So with that, we're going to go to an example and run through our budget template. Okay, here is an example of our budget template. It's not a requirement, but we highly suggest it because it's so user-friendly and it gives you exactly the requirements that A&A provides. So first of all, here is the line item budget, and you're going to need to include a line item budget per year of your project. So it won't, there's no benefit to including a total budget for all the years of your project. A&A, it's just an exercise in futility. A&A doesn't use that. In addition to this, you also need to include a budget justification that goes with it for each year of your project as well. And you notice in the tabs in the template that it's all included. So this is an example. Some of the line items have been filled out, so we can go over this example with you. And what's cool about the template is that the calculations are all included in here, so that this box right here is your total project costs. And you'll notice here outside the line item budget is the calculation for the non-federal share. So while you're in here moving the numbers, adding and subtracting, this will always give you the running total of what you need to commit in your budget. So as you can see here, right now it's $130,000, but we're just beginning. And so far the commitment we need is 26,000 and change. And you'll notice that I have too much already, but this will change as the budget gets fleshed out. Okay, so let's get into start filling things out. Up here, we have a project director that is committed to 100% FTE, and they're getting a salary that's going to be paid for by the project of $50,000. Also included is a project coordinator at 25%, and so 25% of their salary is $11,000 and change. And for the project staff, we need a master teacher that's going to be 100% FTE. So, but that is going to be provided by another source as part of their non-federal share. So we put it in the non-federal share column. And you'll notice that the totals are automatically added up, and then they're included down here for column totals, which is really nice. The fringe benefits, they're usually filled in. I took them out because sometimes they changed, and I didn't want you to think that was the fringe benefits you needed to do, but you're going to work with your finance people to decide to get the correct percentages for, state unemployment, federal unemployment, all those required fringe benefits. One thing to note is that sometimes people ask us if it's required for your A&A project to include health insurance or a retirement plan, and they are not required for an A&A project. But it is something to consider because it's good. it's a benefit to your salaried staff that can collect those things, and it might help with retention. It might attract might attract better candidates, those types of things. So while it's not required, it is a good thing to include if possible. So in the template, the A&E grantee meeting is already included. And since this is year 2, I pulled up the wrong example, but year 1 isn't filled out, but year 1 is already on there in the template, and it's included. The post award for year 1 and the A&E grantee meeting is for each year of the project. So this includes year 2 cost estimates to attend a meeting in Washington, D.C. and they're going to, an additional travel that they want to do is to attend the Smithsonian Institute for 4 people, and they included the cost for that one. Equipment, they're not requesting anything under equipment at this time. And under supplies, we have general office supplies of $200. Contractual, this is a federal budget item, but it's not used very often in A&E applications. A lot of times people put consultants under here because they do have contracts, but in general, contractuals are for very large amounts. And then everything else goes under other. So we're talking about communications, and they're talking about learning systems here, learning management systems here. Staff, office space, and utilities is usually considered under indirect generally, but in this case, they've included it under their non-federal share. So this brings us also to an indirect cost rate. You'll notice here, if you have a negotiated indirect cost rate with a cognizant agent, you would include it in this section and insert the percentage and make the calculation here. But if you don't, you can include it in your line item budget for each item. So that would include, maybe an audit. Maybe it includes custodial expenses. You want to make sure if you're doing this that you only charge A&A for their share of your programming. So it's not like you would charge A&A for the entire audit cost when there are 6 or 7 other projects going on. So you want to make sure that you only charge A&A for their pro rata share. There's also the de minimis rate if you don't have a negotiated agreement. I just mentioned that. If that's something that your organization is interested in, you can look into it. Let's go to the budget justification. So you will notice that the positions, everything you entered under the item description is populated into the budget justification, which is really nice because it makes sure that you don't forget things and you don't, inadvertently omit something. So it's right in here. You notice that the totals are included. They're already added up for you. And then all you do in these boxes here is provide your narrative justification for the position. So the project director would be responsible for the general oversight of the project, including programmatic reporting. Okay, so just a brief explanation of why they're needed for the position. Maybe include an calculation for, this is a 25% person here. You want to make sure you identify what the full time is, and then the 25% so that the amounts match what you included in your line item. And the same thing for all of your other items. For the A&A grantee meeting, you definitely need to break this down. So you want to have, airfare for, 2 times $650 for the airfare. Lodging, you want to make sure you break this down again 2 times whatever your lodging is for as many days. You want to include that rate. You want to make sure that you include all your calculations and your justification and that it matches the amount that you included in your line item budget. And you're going to do that for any other travel as well. And then include those justifications for all the other items in your budget. So this is just a brief overview of the template. It is available through your regional TA centers, and it's just a phone call or an email away. We can definitely send this to you. And we hope that you use it because it's just so user-friendly, and it provides everything that you need to provide the line item and the budget justification requirements for your application.